अस्सलाम वालेकुम एंड गुड इवनिंग। यूर वाचिंग प्राइम टाइम विद नीलम नवाब। नाजरीन, आज का हमारा एक स्पेशल शो है जिसमें हम पाकिस्तान और इंडिया के दरमियान तय पाने वाले इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी यानी सिंध तास मुआहदे पर गुफ्तगू करेंगे और हम अपने इस शो में एक इंतहाई खुसूसी मेहमान से ये जानने की कोशिश करेंगे कि पाकिस्तान और इंडिया के दरमियान वर्ल्ड बैंक की मामलत से 1960 में तय पाने वाले मुआहदे में दरियाओं की तकसीम का फॉर्मूला कैसे बनाया गया और इस मुआहदे का ज्यादा फायदा किसे हासिल हुआ। इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी 1960 में वर्ल्ड बैंक की मामलत में साइन हुआ, जिस पर सिग्नेचर पाकिस्तान की जानिब से उस वक्त के प्रेसिडेंट अयूब खान ने किए और भारत की जानिब से पंडित जवाहरलाल नेहरू ने दस्तखत किए थे इस एग्रीमेंट पर। अब इस मुआहदे में पानी की तकसीम के फॉर्मूले और बाद में आने वाले मसाइल को हल करने के लिए दोनों जानिब से एक कमीशन जो है वो कयाम किया गया और फैसला किया गया कि इस मुआहदे में क्या अहम निकात हैं जो कि शामिल की जाएंगी। हम इस हवाले से पहले एक डिटेल रिपोर्ट देख लेते हैं ताकि हमारे व्यूअर्स को आइडिया हो जाए तमाम बैकग्राउंड का, फिर हम अपनी डिस्कशन को आगे लेकर चलेंगे। लेट्स वॉच अ रिपोर्ट ऑन इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी फर्स्ट।
सितंबर 1960 में भारतीय वज़ीर-ए-आज़म जवाहरलाल नेहरू और पाकिस्तानी सदर अयूब खान के दौर में वर्ल्ड बैंक की मुआवनत से एक मुआहिदा तय पाया, जिसके तहत मगरबी दरियाओं का पानी चनाब, जेहलम, सिंध का पानी पाकिस्तान और मशरकी दरियाओं रावी, ब्यास और सतलुज का पानी इस्तेमाल करने का हक भारत को दिया गया। चनाब, जेहलम, सिंध, सतलुज, ब्यास, रावी मकबूजा कश्मीर से पाकिस्तान की तरफ बहते हैं। मुआहदे के तहत भारत को दिए गए दरियाओं से सैराब होने वाले जनूबी पंजाब के इलाकों के लिए एक नया नहरी निज़ाम बनाया जाना था, जिसके लिए भारत आलमी बैंक और दीगर ममालिक ने फंड्स फ्राहम किए, लेकिन नहरी निज़ाम मुकम्मल ना होने से जनूबी पंजाब का इलाका मुतासिर हो चुका है, जबकि भारत ने पाकिस्तान के हिस्से में आने वाले दरियाओं पर भी डैम बनाना शुरू कर दिया है। पाकिस्तान का मौकिफ है कि भारत मगरबी दरियाओं पर डैम नहीं बना सकता। भारत की इस खिलाफ वर्जी पर पाकिस्तान कई बार वर्ल्ड बैंक जा चुका है, लेकिन ताहाल इस पर कोई फैसला नहीं हुआ।
और इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी पर गुफ्तगू के लिए हमारे साथ जो इंतहाई अहम मेहमान हमें ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं, लेट मी इंट्रोड्यूस यू टू डॉक्टर डैनियल हेन्स। ही इज अ सीनियर लेक्चरर इन एनवायरमेंटल हिस्ट्री इन द यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ब्रिसल, यूके में लेक्चरर हैं और एंड ही इज अ हिस्टोरियन ऑन इंडस वाटर ट्रीटी। दैट्स व्हाई वी thought today to talk on the Indus Water Agreement. Let me welcome you, Dr. Daniel Haynes, in our show Prime Time for tonight. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Haynes here. We would like to know about the history, since in our discussion you mentioned that you are a historian on this Indus Water Agreement. So according to this Indus Water Agreement, the control of the rivers, the three rivers, Ravi, Beas and Sutlej, was given to India, and then Sindh, Jhelum and Chenab river control was given to Pakistan. Why don't you give us some information on how this decision was made and what was the background of this Indian Water Treaty Agreement?
Hello Neelum, Assalamu alaikum. I'm very happy to be here talking to you tonight. To understand the Indus Waters Treaty, you have to go right back to the colonial period in the late 19th century, when the British colonial government wanted to develop water resources across Punjab. And I'm sure that everybody watching this is very familiar with the canal colonies that they constructed there between the 1870s and the 1920s. When partition came, quite suddenly, not very well expected in the 1940s, there was no real attention given to how India and Pakistan, the new state of Pakistan, would handle sharing the river waters of the Indus Basin, and particularly to how the canal colonies in Punjab would get divided up. Various people, including the Muslim League, including the Sikhs on the Indian side and the Indian National Congress, put forward arguments for canal colonies going to one side or the other side of the new border. But in the end, the Radcliffe Commission, which was the British commission set up to decide exactly where the partition boundary would go, decided that they would formally ignore any issues to do with the canal waters, and instead they would just base the boundary on district boundaries. This left the majority of the irrigated area of Punjab in Pakistan, in West Punjab, whereas East Punjab, the Indian side, had more of the land that was yet to be developed. Now, India and Pakistan struck an agreement called the Standstill Agreement in 1947, by which Indian engineers and Pakistani engineers agreed the rivers should just carry on flowing the way they always had been, up until 1 year after the agreement was signed, which happened to be in the spring of 1948. As soon as that standstill agreement expired, Indian engineers reduced the water flow into Pakistan's Bari-Doab Canal system. This caused a huge amount of commotion in Pakistan, as you might expect. People were worried that this meant they wouldn't be able to irrigate their crops, that it would have a big economic effect on West Punjabi farmers, and that people might even not be able to maintain their livelihoods. They might starve. And so the Indian and Pakistani engineers struck a quick, hasty agreement in Delhi a couple of months later, which was extremely weighted towards India's advantage. The West Punjab engineers agreed to pay a very large charge called a seniorage charge to India to allow the canal waters to continue flowing. Now, as you might expect, this agreement was not considered sustainable by the government of West Punjab or by the Pakistani government, and they quickly repudiated that treaty. And things were then at a stalemate for several years. Eventually, an attempt was made to break that deadlock by an American man called David E. Lilienthal. Now, he was the founding director of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, which was an organization that came to try and bring several states in the southern part of the US together to negotiate over shared waters in the Tennessee Valley. And Lilienthal had an idea, a quite radical idea, in the context of India-Pakistan relations at the time, which was that the two countries should do joint integrated development. In other words, you'd sit the Pakistani engineers and the Indian engineers all around the same table, and they could together come up with the best plan to allocate the water resources across the whole Indus Basin. That meant we were no longer just looking at a dispute within Punjab over one canal system, but a dispute about the whole basin. On the basis of Lilienthal's recommendations, the World Bank got involved. I know you mentioned the World Bank. They facilitated negotiations which carried on throughout the rest of the 1950s. But it very quickly became apparent by 1954 that Indian and Pakistani engineers couldn't really work comfortably together, and instead they devised the scheme of effectively partitioning the basin, whereby Pakistan took control of the three western rivers and India took control of the three eastern rivers, and that's the situation we have now.
Right. So, Dr. Haynes, as you explained us the history prior 1960, what was going on in the background before this Indus Water Treaty was finalized. So how do you look at it when you are sitting today, whether the beneficiary of this Indus Water Treaty was Pakistan or India? Were they both equally will they both be equally considered as a beneficiary, or maybe a tilt was more towards one country than the other?
That's a really good question, and it's actually quite a complicated one to answer because the answer changes over time. If you look at the situation in the 1950s and 1960s, you can say that the Pakistan government secured a reasonably good deal. Not a perfect deal, but it was by no means a disaster for the Pakistan side. Think about what Pakistan attained under the treaty. Full use of the three western rivers, which account for somewhere around 80% of the total water flows in the Indus Basin. India took charge of the three eastern rivers. Now, the big problem for Pakistan was that the Satluj Valley Canal project and many of the other West Punjab projects were taking water out of the eastern rivers, out of the Ravi, the Satluj especially, and the Beas rivers. India wanted to assert control over those rivers. This meant that Pakistan had to bring water hundreds of kilometers down from the western rivers to feed those canals in central and West Punjab. What facilitated this was a huge loan that was organized by the World Bank. The majority of the money was put up by the United States and a few other countries such as the United Kingdom, West Germany, Australia, and other sort of Western countries in the Cold War contributed. That settlement was worth $850 million in 1960. In today's terms, that's somewhere around $7 billion. This enabled Ayub Khan's government at the time, Ayub Khan was the president of Pakistan, to construct a huge new set of irrigation works. It provided money for the Mangla Dam and other things. If you look at the situation now, the key difference is that in 1960, India had very little in the way of plans to develop upstream water resources on the western rivers. What we now see is, of course, the very famous disputes over the Baglihar, the Kishan Ganga, and the Ratal projects, but also a series of smaller dams which India has been planning, especially on the Chenab.
I will come to you on this point also. Let me just back you up slightly. According to this Indus Water Agreement, the control of Ravi, Beas and Sutlej were given to India, the control of the water flow, and the Sindh, Jhelum, Chenab river control was given to Pakistan. You think that was the right decision by the World Bank, allocating the water flow of all 6 rivers this way between the two countries as a starting point? Was this the right decision?
It was actually not the World Bank's decision. The World Bank facilitated the negotiations, and in fact it played quite an active role in making suggestions. Ultimately, though, the decision was made by the Pakistani negotiating team, which was led by the civil servant Ghulam Muinuddin, and the Indian negotiating team, which was led by an Indian engineer. And they had the agreement of Muhammad Ayub Khan for Pakistan and Jawaharlal Nehru for India. So actually it was both the technical experts, the negotiating teams, who met repeatedly in Washington, D.C., and also the top political leadership of the two countries which made this decision. It was not a World Bank decision. It wasn't a US decision either.
All right.
What that means is that this
according to the agreement. Yes,
sorry,
go ahead. You
can
finish.
I was going to say, what that means is that this was the best settlement that the Pakistan government at the time thought it was likely to get within the constraints of basically geopolitical reality.
All right. So according to this agreement, if India wants to build a dam on the Western River, he has to show the structure of the dam and get approval from Pakistan first. But we're seeing that India has been violating this agreement, and he's building dams on the Western River, like you also mentioned, Kishan Ganga, and then the hydroelectric plant, and it has totally violated the parameters mentioned in the Indus Water Agreement. So what do you say on this? How can we stop these violations, and why will India violate this agreement so openly?
The questions of the Baglihar and Kishan Ganga dams I'll deal with first, because we talk about India violating the treaty. Pakistan has the option, when it believes that the Indian projects and the Indian designs don't conform with the terms of the treaty, which are pretty strict. Pakistan has the possibility to ask the World Bank to appoint a neutral expert, or to appoint a court of arbitration, which is a 7-member expert panel. The Baglihar and the Kishan Ganga disputes respectively went to the neutral expert and to the court of arbitration. The findings for those cases didn't go in Pakistan's favor necessarily in the way that Pakistanis would want them to. But this is the resolution mechanism that is set up under the treaty. Pakistan still has the possibility to demand to inspect Indian projects. And of course, the Pakistan government and the Pakistani Indus Water Commissioner absolutely should continue to exercise that right. If the Indian side is genuinely violating the treaty, then that's a diplomatic matter where Pakistan needs to make the appropriate representations. But of course, what constitutes violating the treaty is what they're disagreeing about.
Okay, and we're seeing that India is making, it's building another 6 more dams on the Western rivers without approval of Pakistan at all. So you think that this can be stopped, or this can be taken to ICJ or any other international forum?
Well, a referral to the ICJ would be maybe a little difficult, because actually Pakistan tried very hard and very sincerely to get the original matter referred to the ICJ during the late 1940s and the early 1950s, before they started negotiating via the World Bank. India always steadfastly refused to go to the ICJ, and it's my understanding that both parties have to agree to go there. What Pakistan should do, as I said, is insist that India abide by the terms of the treaty, just as Pakistan has the duty to abide by the terms of the treaty. Now, there's a question of what Pakistan can physically do to stop Indian development, which is entirely separate from what the treaty does and doesn't say. But I'd certainly say the diplomatic pressure should be kept up.
You said diplomatic pressure should be build up, if I'm wrong, but if I'm not wrong. But yeah, Dr. Haynes, let me ask you this, that we are also seeing another violation from India that it continues to do. India violates the rule of, how much water flow should be allowed in Pakistan. And India also blocks 0.53 million acre feet of water that is coming to Pakistan. So sometimes it's an overflow that Pakistan has to deal from India when it lets the water flow from the rivers, which bring flooding in Pakistan as well. And then sometimes it blocks the water that has the right of Pakistan on it. So these violations that we are observing from India, like you said, the diplomatic level should be increased to stop India from doing these violations. But other than the diplomatic forums, what options does Pakistan has to deal with these violations?
The short answer, as I said before, is to work through the provisions of the treaty, to ask for the appointment of neutral expert or a court of arbitration, depending on the specifics of the case. But I think it's important here also to take a broader perspective and to think bigger. Because you mentioned the problem of temporary shortages or a temporary surplus in water and what to do about that. We know that climate change is going to have a big impact on this whole region, on the whole Himalaya Hindu Kush region, on South Asia. That includes India and Pakistan. Now, the IPCC report from 2014, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was very clear that over the next 50 years, we can expect to see the glaciers in the Himalaya, including the Western Himalaya and the Hindu Kush, melting away. So what we can expect is actually an increase in major floods, like the terrible, terrible floods that we saw in 2010 and 2011 downstream in Sindh and Punjab. And we can also see an alteration in the El Nino cycle, the oscillation, which is what brings the monsoons over to Pakistan every year and to India. And that is going to become less reliable, according to the IPCC. So India and Pakistan need to take this opportunity now, before we really begin feeling these effects, to talk seriously about how to deal with these two things. Firstly, increased likelihood of flooding, and secondly, increased likelihood of drought. They need to talk sensibly about some flexibility in the arrangement, perhaps where there could be a risk-sharing principle, so that if there is drought, India could make up some of the deficit to Pakistan or vice versa.
All right, so these are the major talking points that can be dealt between the two countries in the right time. We will take a short break here, and after the break, when we come back, we would like to know that is there a possibility for both the countries, Pakistan and India, to renegotiate this agreement, Indus Water Agreement again. Stay with us, we'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. Today we are conducting a very special show on Indus Water Agreement with our special guest here. We have Dr. Daniel Haynes. He's a senior lecturer in environmental history in University of Bristol, UK, and he's a historian on Indus Water Treaty. We covered the historical part of this Indus Water Agreement, and now we are trying to connect the agreement that was conducted in 1960 and as of now when we're standing in 2019, that where does this Indus Water Agreement stands and how is it conducting so far between the two countries? Should Pakistan renegotiate this agreement again with India? And what factors should be talked about again in this agreement? So Dr. Haynes, before going on the break, we were talking whether the factors that we are experiencing as of today, like increase of flooding and increase of drought that you mentioned, were these factors not considered when the Indus Water Agreement was done back in 1960? So is today do we feel the need of renegotiating this agreement with India India again, considering these factors that we are facing as of today?
Well, there are really two parts to this answer, and the first part is to think about these environmental factors, which indeed were not really well considered at the time that the treaty was signed. The big concern really for the Indus dispute during the 1950s and 60s, as I outline in my book, Indus Divided, was irrigation first and foremost. Secondarily, there was some concern about hydropower generation. And so there was no awareness or knowledge in the 1950s that climate change would be a big problem, that water supplies would be unstable as they are now, as we now know with our current understanding. And so the treaty was designed with the assumption that water flows would be reasonably stable. And I definitely think that there is not only scope but a need for Indian and Pakistani negotiators to talk seriously about what to do in the case of increased trouble. In other words, there could be some kind of supplementary agreement to the existing Indus Treaty that deals with these environmental considerations. The second part of your question, though, is whether there's a possibility to completely start again, to scrap the existing treaty and renegotiate it. I don't think that this would be a good idea at all, and I'll explain why. Firstly, imagine if there was no treaty, if Pakistan simply now decided on its own that it would get rid of the treaty. That would mean that there was no mechanism at all for inspecting or criticizing or attempting to restrain any of the Indian upstream development, which is such a big concern to Pakistanis today. This actually is the situation we have with Afghanistan on one side of the basin and China on the other. Neither of these countries are party to the existing Indus Waters Treaty, and there is no mechanism in place, according to the treaty, to stop them from using any of the upstream water. And in this scenario, both India and Pakistan are downstream powers. So perhaps there's some mutual interest between India and Pakistan to think about what these other upstream countries might do. The second point I want to make on this topic is that the treaty in 1960 actually represented a bit of a moment of strength for Pakistan, especially in its relationship to India. Ayub Khan's government came in 1958, and although, as we know, by 1968, Ayub Khan had become less popular and there were some protests against his government and he had to leave office. In those first couple of years, he was fairly popular and he had quite a lot of strength behind his government. This gave him a position where he could make a deal that Indian negotiators would believe would stick. On the other hand, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, who for most of his career was a very strong figure, by 1960, his health was beginning to fail, his economic development plans were in a little bit of trouble, so Nehru had quite a pressing need actually to reach a settlement with Pakistan. This was a good moment of opportunity for Pakistan to press its case. And also, Nehru was becoming increasingly worried about China, and as we know, India later went to war with China in the early 1960s. So when Pakistan came to negotiate the final settlement with India in 1960, this was quite a good moment. And there haven't been many moments in the subsequent history of the two countries where Pakistan has been able to get so much leverage. The second point I would make is that the original treaty doesn't actually stand on its own. We talk about the treaty, but it was really a case of the treaty on the one hand and the Indus Basin Development Fund on the other. Now, the United States and various other Western countries put up more than $850 million in 1960 terms of funding. That's somewhere in the region of $7 billion in today's terms. That kind of huge funding for water development in India and Pakistan was controversial at the time, and actually the American government had quite a lot of difficulty getting that funding through its own political system. And I don't see exactly where such an equivalent amount of funding for more water development in the Indus Basin would come from. For those reasons, I would suggest that actually Pakistan's best option now is to stick with the original treaty, make full use of all the provisions for inspecting and checking Indian upstream developments to restrain any problems that there might be, while also thinking, as I said, about environmental issues, droughts and floods.
In your opinion, Pakistan should stick to the original agreement, but a supplementary agreement can be done, or a supplementary addition can be done to the original agreement, in which the environmental issues can be considered. That's what you're suggesting as of now.
That's what I'd like to see happening. I should say, of course, I'm not an expert in international law. I'm not a diplomat or an international negotiator. And I'm not best placed to comment on the practicalities of exactly how India and Pakistan could go about making a new agreement. But I think clearly this is what's necessary.
All right. Let me bring the discussion to another sort of angle here. As you also know that occupied Kashmir is the major conflict between the two countries, India and Pakistan, as of now. So what do you think? How is Kashmir dispute linked to the Indus dispute? Is there a connection between the two?
This is a really fascinating question, and I have to say it's the single thing that gave me the most trouble, the most sleepless nights when I was writing my book, is what exactly is the relationship between Kashmir and the Indus waters. And ultimately, I think this is another answer that changes over time. The Kashmir issue and the Indus issue have some geographical connection. Very obviously, the rivers run through Kashmir before they reach the plains, the western rivers, that is.
Right.
However, I didn't find any direct evidence that really the Kashmir dispute was just a cover for capturing water, and I didn't find any direct evidence either for the opposite claim, that the water dispute was just a way to make a claim on Kashmir. And in fact, the two issues became thoroughly entangled. So Liaquat Ali Khan, our first Prime Minister here in Pakistan, said in 1948 that nature had effectively fashioned Pakistan and Kashmir together because the rivers ran through Kashmir, and at the time the main road access also from Kashmir was into West Punjab, into Pakistan, not into India. And yet at the same time, the actual settlement in the end, the Indus Treaty as it exists, is very careful not to say anything at all about Kashmir. In fact, the preamble, the opening of the treaty document, states explicitly that nothing in this agreement shall be taken to mean that there are any other rights at stake other than the specific flows of the water. And one of the only ways that the two negotiating teams could get to the point where they would ask their political leaders to sign the agreement, to sign the treaty, was that they both insisted there should be no connection between the territorial claims of the two countries on Kashmir and the claims on the Indus rivers. So you'll find in the annexures to the treaty, which provide for the rules under which India may construct hydroelectric projects in Kashmir across the line of control, where they will name the location of the projects, but there's no acknowledgement that this is in disputed territory. So what we now have is a situation where both countries at the same time do connect the rivers in the Kashmir dispute, but also in another sense don't connect the two disputes. And this has caused quite a lot of confusion over the years. And actually there were quite serious suggestions from the Pakistan government to settle the Kashmir problem during the 1950s by giving Pakistan control over the river Chenab, and then reaching a settlement for the rest of the country, but it never quite worked out.
All right, so the two disputes, in your opinion, they're not interlinked at all.
Forgive me if that's the impression I gave. What I meant is, while they are linked by both historical claims which both countries have made and by the geographical fact that the rivers flow through Kashmir, it's not easy to say that one dispute is just a cover story for the other dispute. So while there is a link, I think this link it's always shifting, it's always changing.
All right, so coming on to the Kashmir dispute, I'm sure you know that how the annexation of Kashmir has been done on August 5th by India. What is, in your point of view, what is the solution of this Kashmir dispute?
I think the solution to the Kashmir dispute is something that many very, very clever people have been trying to solve for a long time. I know that the Pakistan government will do everything in its power to try to meet the current situation. I don't feel qualified to offer a solution to this, I'm afraid. But very clearly, the dispute does need to be settled for the sake of the people in Kashmir.
All right, let's get back to the original topic that we started in this water treaty. Do you think that as of now, Pakistan is the main beneficiary of this agreement, or now as time is proceeding, India is becoming the main beneficiary?
I think the current situation is that the water flows which were allocated to Pakistan are mainly being used. So there isn't a huge amount of scope now for Pakistan to get more water out of the Indus River system. There's a huge opportunity, of course, to use new drip irrigation technology to increase efficiency, to look at protecting the downstream aspect, the Indus Delta region in Sindh, which has a pressing need for regeneration. I'm so sorry, would you mind repeating your question?
Yes, I asked you that who's the beneficiary if you see the current scenarios? Is it India or Pakistan? Who's the main beneficiary to this agreement?
Thank you. So the situation now is that India for 40 years did very little to make use of the provisions in the treaty that it could develop upstream dam projects and upstream water resources. India is now making the maximum possible use of that provision, and of course, from a Pakistani point of view, is potentially even going beyond what the treaty allows for. So currently, India is in a position to make more use of the provisions of the treaty than Pakistan is. What I would say, though, is that the treaty does specify that neither party should unduly interfere with the flow of water into the other party's territory. And perhaps there's an opportunity here for Pakistan to try and move away from the present approach that both sides have taken to disagreements over Indian projects upstream, which is to look at each project individually from a very technical point of view. Perhaps there's scope for looking at what is the overall impact of the totality of Indian development upstream, rather than just looking at each project individually, where it's more or less a technical question of engineering.
All right, and then we have this large section of agriculture that the water is used for this agricultural purpose. So do you think that making dam at the Indian side, how India is doing it, there are 6 dams under construction as well. So you think that the flow of water would be stopped towards Pakistan, which could be used for the agricultural purpose? That could affect the irrigation in Pakistan as well.
It's extremely unlikely that the flow of water would be stopped in total, because constructing that kind of storage capacity would be very, very difficult. The problem to think about really is the timing of the water flows, because as you'll know and as your viewers will know, there are 2 main growing seasons in Pakistan, the Kharif season and the Rabi season. And if the farmers don't get the necessary amount of water to water their crops at the beginning of these growing seasons, that's where the problem lies.
All right. Now, wrapping up our this topic for the show, what suggestions would you like to give to Pakistan to consider if in case a supplementary agreement or any kind of review on this agreement is considered by both the countries?
I would love to see the Pakistani side take the initiative on looking at environmental protection. So the ecosystem of the Indus River is not just important for its own sake, but it's also what hundreds of thousands of people's livelihood depends on, especially in the Indus Delta. And any new agreement with India really needs to seriously think about the availability of water flow downstream right the way into the mangrove forests in the Indus Delta. I'd like to see much more consideration to water quality and pollution. The current treaty does have a very small paragraph on water quality and industrial pollution, but in the present day scenario of booming populations and increased industrialization, this needs to be taken much more seriously. And of course, Pakistan should think about how it can manage the droughts and floods which are likely to come in this region and across the whole world. This is not just a problem that Pakistan is facing, but a global one. But I think that
thank you
with
very much, Dr.
commitment
Daniel Haynes.
and goodwill, it can be solved.
Yes, you can finish. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Haynes, for joining us. And absolutely, we had a lot of information on this agreement that we would like to discuss some other time. But yes, as you said, that Pakistan should consider how to manage the drought. That's one of the factors that has become a serious issue due to the environmental impact. And then the flooding that we get every time when India releases water from his side of the water flow of the rivers. And then we just recently last week experienced in Punjab, you know, how they had to deal with those floods. So let's hope that this agreement should have some kind of a supplementary addition to it in which these recent environmental issues can be considered. Thank you very much for joining us, and that's it for tonight. See you all tomorrow night. Until then, take care of yourself and Pakistan. Allah Hafiz and good night.